Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle, as always, Talkin Liberty. It's when we reveal afresh our constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, regular contributor, and our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza.
Tim, I hope you love saying it. I love hearing it. Thank you, and it's good to be here.
It's sort of a plus-some game.
It brightens up my day like a
I
Christmas
love to
present,
say it,
you know what I
and
mean?
you love to hear it. What could be better? Let's
go.
start with Michael Flynn. What's new?
Wow, there's a lot there. I think the one thing to take away in terms of news is that his legal team has now appealed Judge Sullivan's decision to call for briefs in opposition to the motion for the Justice Department to withdraw the charges. And it seems like Judge Sullivan has acted outside the bounds of sort of normal practice for federal judges. Whether that is unconstitutional or not is a bit hasn't been ruled on, Tim. But I think that the pro-liberty forces would all say that it is unconstitutional what he's done, and he's applied now to a higher court for relief.
In looking at the accusations against Michael Flynn, is there any legitimate reason for this judge to believe that justice has not been served or that it's been denied by Michael Flynn having the charges dropped against him?
Tim, I think that that's a bad question to pose, and the reason why is it's not for the judge to determine. That is a function of the executive. Our system of limited and enumerated powers and the division of powers and checks and balances that we often talk about, it is the decision of so the legislature defines what it will be crimes as they pass laws, and it's up to the executive function to enforce those criminal laws. They make all kinds of decisions about whom to prosecute and why. Now, the authority that the judge has to approve or not the decision not to prosecute, the reason why that was ensconced in the law, Tim, is to protect accused peoples. I read a very interesting blog post about this by Tim Lynch, who is a constitutional scholar on the Federalist's blog, and he talks about how this was designed as a protection so that if the government were going to charge you and then remove those charges and then refile them, you would have the protection of the judge perhaps saying, well, let's only dismiss them with prejudice so they couldn't be refiled. In other words, it was a protection against government overreach.
Right.
We don't have anywhere in American jurisprudence some kind of judicial protection against somebody not being charged with a crime. Judges, if they want to go ahead and be U.S. attorneys, they can probably, get that job depending on who's in the administration. I suspect Judge Sullivan would have to wait for a Democrat president to be a U.S. attorney because he seems to be practicing like a Democrat judge, with his actions in the Flynn case.
Political considerations are penetrating the judicial system to a degree that I think none of us have probably witnessed before.
You can imagine how the leftists, Tim, would howl if this were, instead of a convenient punching bag, an underprivileged defendant in like an urban setting.
He must have done something that's worthy
Right.
of keeping him in a cage.
These things that have been done to Michael Flynn, they're done all the time to lesser defendants.
Right.
And by lesser, I mean in terms of their status in society.
Right.
We're just not exposed to them because when those people talk about the charging of their children or the threats to charge their children, those things don't make the front page like it does when it's Mr. Flynn.
Let's move to Texas, where the Supreme Court has heard its first mail-in ballot case, the first of what are going to be many in the months ahead leading up to the election.
That's right. And I didn't think that this was necessarily a particularly important of the 50 states, Tim, ballot issues, but I just think that we need to talk about it in some regard and just pick one, throw a dart at it. The Ken Paxton, the state's attorney general, filed for a writ asking the state's high court to stop 5 of the county's election officials from telling voters they can vote by mail by checking the disability box. You need a reason to vote by. They have to have one of several delineated legal reasons to not vote in person. And they're saying, you don't have to, just check the disability box. But it's not a disability if you don't have, a fear of catching an illness is not a disability, according to the Republicans. Seems like the Democrats want the opposite, which is that everybody can vote. And I think that we're going to see these battles, just every place that there are really contested elections.
I won't speak to the intentions of those who seek more rather than less mail-in ballots because I can't get in their heads. But I can tell you there's nothing more ripe for voter fraud than mail-in ballots when in this kind of situation. And everybody knows it, of course. Now, 2 cases for economic freedoms were reinstated by state Supreme Courts this week.
I think this is really good news for Liberty, Tim. In both of these cases, these actors were basically bullied by state governments because they didn't have these occupational licensing that often are so onerous, and they're put up as a barrier to competition rather than some genuine effort at maintaining the health and welfare of the populace. And I think it was in Georgia there was a lactation consultant, and I think in Pennsylvania there was somebody who was like an Airbnb type manager. And in both instances, the state required them to get all this licensing. I forget what the lactation consultant was supposed to get, but the Airbnb person, they said they were selling. They were basically being a real estate agent without a license, and they weren't selling anything. They were just managing some Airbnbs. Anyway, the lower state courts dismissed those claims. They haven't decided in favor of those litigants, but they've said we will hear the cases, and that is an important win, I think, that they're actually going to hear them. Sadly, the federal courts have treated economic liberty as a kind of redheaded stepchild. If there's a free speech case, it's one thing, but an economic liberty case is another. So it's good to see some movement in the state courts on this front.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Now, I want you to stick around because we're going to do something different. I want to mourn the death of an old friend. I want to read this because it's an obituary printed in the London Times, and I think it speaks to where we are today. Today we mourn the passing of a beloved old friend, Common Sense, who had been with us for many years. No one knows for sure how old he was since his birth records were long ago lost in bureaucratic red tape. He'll be remembered as having cultivated such valuable lessons as knowing when to come in out of the rain, why the early bird gets the worm, life isn't always fair, and maybe it was my fault. Common Sense lived by simple, sound financial policies, don't spend more than you can earn, and reliable strategies. Adults, not children, are in charge. His health began to deteriorate rapidly when well-intentioned but overbearing regulations were set in place. Reports of a 6-year-old boy charged with sexual harassment for kissing a classmate, teens suspended from school for using mouthwash after lunch, and a teacher fired for reprimanding an unruly student only worsened his condition. Common Sense lost ground when parents attacked teachers for doing the job that they themselves had failed to do in disciplining their unruly children. It declined even further when schools were required to get parental consent to administer sun lotion or an aspirin to a student, but could not inform parents when a student became pregnant and wanted to have an abortion. Common Sense lost the will to live as the churches became businesses and criminals received better treatment than their victims. Common Sense took a beating when you couldn't defend yourself from a burglar in your own home and the burglar could sue you for assault. Common Sense finally gave up the will to live after a woman failed to realize that a steaming cup of coffee was hot. She spilled a little in her lap and was promptly awarded a huge settlement. Common Sense was preceded in death by his parents, truth and trust, by his wife, discretion, by his daughter, responsibility, and by his son, reason. He is survived by 5 stepchildren. I know my rights. I want it now. Someone else is to blame. I'm a victim. And, the littlest one, pay me for doing nothing. Not many attended the funeral of Common Sense because so few realized he was gone. If you still remember him, pass this on. If not, join the majority and do nothing. Think about it. That's where we are today.